In this video, we'll be exploring the rate of change. In other words, all life is a cycle, is an iterative process of evolution, is change. The entire fabric of reality is a fractal echoing machine of change. From subatomic particles that are changing their state constantly, to atoms, molecules, to everything that exists, whether it's the planet spinning around at thousands of miles per hour or the sun. All of life is change. And the question we'll be exploring is, when is change too fast and when is change too slow? And particularly identity change. Because an identity is a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And that pattern can change in a traumatic or a transcendent event. And the question is, for an ego that identifies with the pattern, that grounds itself to the family, the familiarity of the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. How fast is too fast? And the way I would frame it is that the one, the infinite whole, the ecology, is refracted in a healthy state into a somewhat symmetrical, somewhat balanced, but very crude system. When you take the infinite distinctions, the infinite number of lines, the infinite number of dots that is used to compose any circle, any sphere, and you break it down to concepts, to groupings, in a very crude sense, the work-life balance, or in a slightly more sophisticated sense, you have the heart, the mind, the body, and the spirit, let's say. You create a crude mock-up or symbol of the complexity of all that is. Now, when you start off with a system, which is really the way that you divide the one, if you divide the one into 5, you have a 5-point system. If you divide the one into polarity, you have a 2-point system. If you divide the world into 27, you have a 27-point system. Now, once you've refracted your paradigm, your system, into a series of words that have some basic symmetry, like you might say earth, fire, wind, and water, or you might say north, south, east, and west. This is taking the infinite directions or the infinite gradations in all matter, and it's refracting them into 4. Once you have, in this case, a system of 4, one of the easiest ways to develop the system is to turn it into a system of 8. You keep the symmetry, you don't disturb the underlying system. If you can manage a system of 4, well, it's a reasonable aspiration to manage a system of 8, right? I went from my work-life balance, a difficult system, to my spirituality, my social life, my work life, my personal life, let's say. That's a system of 4. It's a more rounded thing. And I might go from that to exploring the shadow side of my spirituality to the uplifting and light side of my spirituality, the darker side of my personal relationships, the usury and betrayal, the deceit, the lack of integrity, and also the upside, the positives and negatives, right? So that would be a way to add sophistication without annihilation. And so this is a generally constructive process of evolution, to take 4 into 8, to take 8 into 16, right? So how could we do that? Well, we could add a distinction, such as, waking time and sleeping time in each of these dimensions, or we could add a time of this is the way I play out these roles when I'm on vacation, and this is the way I play out these roles when I'm not on vacation, or we might take it into another distinction, like this is who I want to be when I'm retired, or you might start developing each of these arenas at different levels to say, I'm going to do this unconsciously to semi-consciously to consciously, or reactively to witnessing the reaction, to making choices, to being proactive, right? You can create different distinctions of growth in each of these different areas. And then you can start developing those out in a way that turns each distinction to, maybe 10 more distinctions on a gray scale. And so this is the path of growth. Now, what's important to understand, what I want to kind of explore here, is that in many ways there are not right and wrong ways of classifying or dividing up the one into many. The more distinctions in a system, the more consciousness. And the more balance and complexity in a system, the more grace, the more ease you have. It's very much like a wheel. If you have a symmetrical wheel, you can drive fast and feel very comfortable. If you have a watermelon-shaped wheel, the faster you go, the more violent the ride will be. And so as we develop a model of reality in order to be aware of parts of it, then, the more symmetrical, the more complex, the more graceful our lives will be. Now, there is a point of chaos which could be called melting, right? And so you could kind of think of this as a ball of liquid gold. And if you get a perfectly symmetrical ball, and this isn't perfectly symmetrical, but if you were to get a ball of gold and you were to, cut it into a triangular shape as a starting point, right? Now you're developing it, you're refining its potential. And then if you were to go in and cut off each of, these areas here, so now you have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-sided shape. And you can go in and cut off each of the 6-sided pieces here, each of the corners, and you can get a 12-sided shape. You can develop it in that sense in a way that maintains its symmetry, but also is graspable. It's coherent enough that you and I can follow along, that the ego, the I that is trying to identify with a pattern, can keep up to speed and feel, oh, I know what that's about. But there's a certain rapidity or randomness in change, at which point the ego says, I have no idea how we got here, why we're here, what's going on, what's coming next. It's a total mess. It's just chaotic. And usually what happens is the ego will go back to square one. Okay, that's it. Everyone go home, back to the drawing board, and we have to start off all over again, right? So if you're not growing at all, right, if you're just staying in the duality, for example, it's a very, boring and stuck place. But also, if you start zigzagging around in a way that neither you nor anyone else can find a coherent pattern, what are you going to do with that? And so it's also back to the drawing board. And so, you have both of these places are stuck, right? Because one is stuck because the chaos is so rapid, so deep that you're lost. This can happen with transcendent experiences, including psychedelics, near-death experiences, revelations, believing all your life that communism is evil, and then going to some place like Denmark where they have democratic capitalist socialism and saying, wait a minute, they have a higher quality of life. So whenever your foundational points in any system are rocked, are shattered, your foundational assumptions upon which you build everything else, whenever data presents itself that undermines the validity and the certainty in a foundational cornerstone of a system, it brings chaos, right? Because everything else is built on top of it. The idea that good is good and bad is bad, for example. If your entire system is built on suppressing and controlling bad and doing this, well, if that's rocked, meaning if you experience some data that countervenes that point, and you really feel that, you let that in, your entire system collapses because the foundation rocks, because the foundation isn't solid. There's no certainty. And this is a place of terror, helplessness, often known as the void. Everything that I've been doing is a lie. I did this because of that, and I did that because of that, and I did that because I believed this. But now I'm seeing new data that questions that assumption or is in direct opposition. Now, systems are always fragile by nature. They're held together by the ego, and all systems have data that undermines them. Right? If you take the probability field, right, if you take the probability field and divide it into two, the pendulum swings in both directions. And in order to establish a cornerstone, a foundation, you have to focus on this part of the data, and you have to ignore this part of the data. And so all systems are built on control. All systems are built on ignorance. All systems that an ego is attaching to, is identifying with, are also frightening. They're vulnerable, and there's fear. There's fear of the unknown because the unknown always contains undermining aspects of our dogma, of our system, right? Because what makes a tendency, a dogma, or a system is this sense of I need this to be true so that this can be true, so that that can be true, so that I can have a stable pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. I need a stable pattern, says the ego, so that I can feel in control, so that I can predict things. I need a stable identity. And it's not coming, I don't have it. The fact that you have a true God and I have a true God, and God takes care of their chosen people, but my son died. And you have a chosen God that takes care of your people, but your son didn't die, right? And there's a certain point where what we would call anomalous data is clear enough that the system collapses. And a good way of visualizing the anomalous data is that a system establishes a model of reality that covers certain territory. So this model of reality, as part of the one, as part of the whole, covers this area, right? And it's self-evident. What I mean by that is we can all see the triangle and we can all see the data within the triangle that supports the system. All of this stuff that I'm coloring in here supports this model of reality. The trouble is, this stuff out here negates this model of reality, right? This is the anomalous data. So as soon as you create a system, all gays are heinous people, all abortions are bad, all abortions are good, all gays are good, communism is evil in all respects, right? Capitalism is good in all respects. Capitalism is evil in all respects. It doesn't matter what your system is. As soon as you are dogmatic and absolute, this is the way it is because that's the way it is, and that's the way it was that way because that's the way it's been for all time, and this is the way it is. As soon as you establish that as an absolute foundational certainty, the only thing real is matter, and matter is this, this, and this. As soon as you create those lines, which are not lines in reality, they're lines in belief, they're lines in thought. They hopefully have something to do with reality, meaning there's hopefully lots of data that supports that statement, that belief, right? In this case, all of this data in here does. But as soon as you create a system with clear lines, you create an outcast. Now, how do you create the outcast? With the line, right? As soon as you create this line here, you have cast all of this stuff outside the line. So whenever you create a system, you create an outcast. You create a shadow. You create stuff that doesn't fit into an either-or system. And that reality, that which doesn't fit within our system, also has data, lots of it. And it's undermining data. This data, all this stuff out here, all these facts, undermine the system. So the system of the triangle is the only one, and the one and only triangle, and the great triangle, and the triangle for all time, and everyone should be a triangle, and anything that isn't a triangle isn't right, and all that. That whole system, which has all this lovely supporting data in here, all this stuff supports that, is undermined, is threatened, is challenged by all the data that's outside of it, right? And what you'll generally find is that the most dogmatic, the most fundamentalist people, whether they're fundamentalist scientists or fundamentalist Christians or fundamentalist Muslims or fundamentalist atheists or fundamentalist materialists, they start very strongly with a few core assumptions. Number one, and those are anchored usually to the core of the data, right? So within any data set, there's a core set of data that's very, very undeniable, right? You say the reality of the five senses, if you're a materialist or an atheist or whatever, and you say it's very undeniable. You have a hand, I have a hand, you feel the hand, you can do it, I can do it, da-da-da. That's real, right? And all this other stuff is just bullshit, that's, and then names get, it's witchcraft, it's superstition, it's old wives' tales, right? It's whatever undermines everything else, right? So there's a core thing that's clear and it's true. And so that's what's used to bow to. That's what the dogmatist, the theorist, the philosopher bows to, is that core construct that supports the cornerstones of the system. And there's usually a corner to, several corners of the system, and then there's data that relates to that. And then every time you try and threaten their system, they will point to the stuff that supports the system. Doesn't matter what it is. You can't argue with that. Wheels do go round, right? But, of course, the reality is that this other data out here is not saying anything to do with wheels go round, right? It's saying wheels do go round and people have near-death experiences. But wheels go round. We all know wheels, yes. And people have near-death experiences, right? And the same is true on the other side. If factions form within your system, then, the one says, but 10,000 people or 10 million people have all had these near-death experiences, and the other person says, yes, and look at all these wheels going around, and look at all these people with these near-death experiences, and look at all these wheels going around. They just look at different things that support their system. And in order for a system to seem really permanent, right, and this is very appealing to fundamentalists, because fundamentalists of all kinds are frightened by complexity, the unknown, chaos, uncertainty, helplessness, not being able to know what's going to happen next. And so when people have strong traumatic experiences that make them terrified of chaos and the unknown, they will gravitate to fundamentalist dogmas that promise them that if they just hold tight enough to those beliefs and surround themselves with people who agree with them, that they will not be subjugated to the unknown, to chaos, to helplessness again. And so if they just ignore all the anomalous data, surround themselves with people in some form of cult that all agrees to look at this one area, that is, admittedly, every cult that's halfway intelligent has a few foundational reference points to reality that are pretty solid. Someone who is a seismologist, right? They have all kinds of data that point to the seismic activity of the Earth. It's pretty solid, and I believe this, and I believe that, and it correlates to all this data. Or I believe that I believe that God exists, and I look at all this data. I believe that God doesn't exist. Look at all this data. Everyone has a reasonable, moderately intelligent person can point to the area of reality that supports their system. And as I say, the more frightened they are of complexity, paradox, and the unknown, the more they will hold on to not only is this a valid system, but it is the only system. And very, very frightened, insecure people will try to kill anyone who upsets them, which are basically the people that present the anomalous data, right? Because the purpose of any outcast or skeptic is to challenge the system that excludes it, right? So if you're a scientist back in the 15th century, your job is, your science is taking you away from the Catholic Church and away from other fundamentalist religions and pointing out that the evidence seems to say this, right? So you're an outcast, you're a heretic, you're believing that there's something to this anomalous data. This bit here seems to be solid. Right? And so does this, and so does that, right? So you're believing the anomalous data. And your job is to present the anomalous data to the system in power, to the dominant framework, and say, these core assumptions that our whole cult is based on, our whole culture is founded on, are questionable, because there's no room in the cult for this and this and this, and yet, here's this anomalous data, and here's this anomalous data, and here's this anomalous data. These anomalies do not fit into the paradigm. Now, the first thing that an oppressive cult of any kind will do is kill the messenger and suppress the data. It's very easy. 95% of people are Catholics and the king follows what you have to say, whatever, you can just start killing people. And of course, that's exactly what the Christians did in all kinds of indigenous tribes around the world, as they went around giving people two choices. You have two choices. Number one, You can give up all your beliefs and all the data that supports what you believed, and you can adopt our cult. Number one. Or you can be murdered. What's it going to be? So that's the first stage, and that's when there's still a lot of power in the dominant system. You can join us, or you can die, and you can die socially by being outcast. You can die emotionally by being ridiculed. You can die mentally by, again, being ridiculed and being ostracized. You can die institutionally by not getting any funding. You can die physically by, being executed, or not having any money, etc. So there's a million ways to die, but the dominant paradigm that people cling to as their identity is something that usually it scoffs at and just, poor fellow, he thinks science is real. My goodness, he doesn't realize the Lord created everything in 7 days. He'll come round. He's not a bad sort. I'll get him to apologize and I'll keep him out of public view. Just don't kill him, right? Okay, the magnanimousness of the Catholic Church. We won't kill your relatives for, the absurd idea that science exists. But, the same is true in reverse, right? We won't drum you out of, as the scientific paradigm and the atheists and stuff get hold, then it's the other way around. Like, get him out of here. We don't want any of you lot in our laboratories. And if you don't follow the scientific method, you get zero funding. Zero, right? So no funding, no credibility. We're not going to write you up in any papers. You go off to your little church, your little church magazine. But the real stuff is happening here. And so, and in the middle, there's polite argument, like, well, if what you said was true, like, so you tend to have respectful behavior at a balance of power, right? The abusive relationships tend to be when one side has all the power. But the dirty truth of every single system that has ever existed is that it all has anomalous data. And the fanatics that develop the system are loath to admit the reality of the data that doesn't support their system, right? If you've seen the benefit of vaccines, and you've developed vaccines, and you believe that the world is going to be a better place with vaccines, you should look at the atrocities being committed, silencing the voices of people who are having reactions to vaccines, silencing the voices of people who are questioning vaccines, silencing the scientists that have criticism of the way certain vaccines are developed or are presented or are mandated, right? Right, it's the exact same thing, burning witches at the stake, right? Because they're not following the way that we think. But there is always going to be data that suggests that there are benefits to not vaccinating and that there are benefits to vaccinating, right? And a very secure paradigm with very secure people that are comfortable with complexity and weighing the pros and cons and don't need a parental figure to say, do this in the name of the parent, in the name of the Lord, in the name of the dogma of the day, will want to see the evolving balance back and forth, right? Vaccines seem to be very good in this demographic, in this situation. Not so much over here. This vaccine seems to be doing a better job than this vaccine. If you've already caught a virus, the negatives of being vaccinated may outweigh the positives since you've already developed your own immunity, right? So how about that, right? So all of these types of questions, right, they're complex. And there, whatever position you take, there will be data, if you look, that contradicts what you say. However, thought and belief are so powerful as blinders that the more we believe something, the less we look at the data that contradicts us. So if I'm a big believer in, this whole shebang, right? I just can't, for the life of me, see any of these little bits out here. I just don't get it. Those are all quacks out there. Well, have you met them? They don't seem like what would you call a quack? Some hick, right? Okay, what would you call that? Well, someone with from the South, who didn't finish high school. Well, you'd be surprised. There's a University of Oxford graduate. There's they've been brainwashed, right? You just push away all of the data that doesn't agree with you, right? And it's wonderful, right? And then you reaffirm, you pay homage to the system, the cult, right? And it all looks clean and nice again, right? And so we're no longer confronted with the enormous complexity of reality. The enormous complexity, the fact that certain laws of physics might be true for 1 trillion years, and then there's a step change, right? Stock market is always going to rise, and then there's a big recession, right? There's certain cycles that take a millisecond. There's certain cycles that take a day. There's certain cycles that take 1,000 years. There are certain cycles that take 100 billion years, and things keep going this way for 1 billion years, and then they change course again. Just like all that was happening in red. And now, right, now I've changed to white, right? So now there's a different pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. There's a different pattern of behavior in reality. And for every person, based on the fragility of their ego, which correlates to the amount of sustained trauma, the fragility of their ego, like how insecure is the I that identifies with a pattern. Like, I don't want to face reality. I don't want to be faced with the unknown, right? I don't want to look at that and say, I'm overwhelmed. I can't deal with that. I'm so overwhelmed. I can't deal with that. How fragile, how quickly will someone fall into that place of overwhelm? Well, if you fall at, the mail said that our package arrived, you look outside the door, my package is gone. The tracking number said the package was dropped at 2 p.m. There's no package. What's happened? What's happened, right? If that's the kind of fragility of a weak ego, weak just meaning it's fragile, right? I don't know who I am because my package didn't arrive. Well, then questioning the fundamental premises of your entire cult is probably not a good idea. Right? But if you have a job where you have a stable history where the world did not come to an end and you question a new line of thought every year, you're hired at university to explore different philosophies and you get a new philosophical book that questions the entire foundation of everything that you've known, it's probably going to be okay, right? As long as you go about it in a way that is somewhat familiar, somewhat of the family. It's going to be okay. We each have an edge where if things change, if there's too much doubting information and not enough confirming information, where the whole system begins to crumble. And then if this doesn't make sense, then that doesn't make sense. And what am I doing? And if that doesn't make sense, why am I even getting out of bed? And, if the entire system is crumbling, then it's probably good to assert a new system. Not because it's true, but because it's useful, meaning to navigate our day, we've got to start a pattern. We've got to go round and round waking up, falling asleep, eating, shitting, waking up, falling asleep, eating, shitting, waking up, falling asleep, and going to work, and finding someone interesting to talk to, and read a book, right? So the pattern gets more and more interesting, right? You keep doing the same thing again and again, it quickly gets boring. So then you need variation, you need variety. Every seventh day I take a pause, and you start, it's like music. Dung, 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 dung. That's my pattern. Dung, 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 dung. The new pattern's a little more interesting, right? And so with all of life, you start with a pattern. Why? Because that's what life is. That's all life is a pattern, right? And we get to choose what our foundational patterns are, and we get a default assumption. It's called our cult or culture. This is the way things are. We start a default assumption. Dung, 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 dung. Why is everyone doing the same thing? They were all born into that cult where that's the rhythm. That's what they do. They go to work at this, they do that, they wear these clothes, they don't wear those clothes. But then let's liven it up. How about casual Fridays? Let's do that, right? Dun, 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 bing, dun, 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 bing, dun, 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 bing. It's called music. It's called art, right? So you start with a boring system, you get the rhythm, and once you can hold that rhythm, you start spicing it up a little. Every 5 times, you spice it up a little bit. Then that gets boring. So then you, bing, right? You do another movement, another shape. Now, every so often, you have to go back to zero. You have to go into silence again. You have to go all the way back to nothing, all the way before the Big Bang, to not knowing where I am and what do I want to do now. That's a new composition. That's a new stage of life, right? And some people, they can't do it. Like, I don't want to stop working because I'd be faced with the question, what to do with my life? And I don't know, right? So I'm going to just keep working, and maybe I'll come across something in the next 20 years that gives me some clues, and that's what I'll do after work, right? And so chaos, boredom, chaos, and overwhelm, boredom, apathy, and rigidity, right? Whenever you're in rapid change and transformation, you are not bored, but you may be overwhelmed, right? Whenever you are in a routine rut, right? You've got predictability, you've got control, you've often got a lot of boredom. So that's, what we want to do is work towards life, work towards change to a degree that is engaging and interesting, and in which we are participating in evolution, but not to the point where it becomes so chaotic and overwhelming that we can't keep track of it. And so we basically curl up in a little ball in a fetal position and wait for it all to stop till it gets simple enough and slow enough for us to manage again. And some people, they'll just self-sabotage. The boss asks for one more thing, and it's just, I can't do it, I'm not doing it, I'm not going to do any of it, I'm not going to pay my bills, I'm not going to look in the mail, I'm not going to look this, and their entire life collapse. They find themselves with no possessions on the street. That's overwhelming, all those cars, and then eventually they kind of, okay, I can handle this. I get up, I walk 3 feet, I pee over in these bushes, I'll start over again, right? But the challenge is not to push oneself or another to such a point of overwhelm and chaos and uncertainty and desperation that the whole thing collapses. The challenge is to move from simple patterns to more complex patterns. From more complex patterns to more complex patterns, and get to a certain degree of proficiency, and at some point the song comes to an end, and then you start a new pattern. It's been a pleasure chatting together. Thank you for your attention, and take care.